June 10, 1942. The desert wind howled across the sun-baked ridges near Bir Hakeim as Oberleutnant Dieter Krauser adjusted his goggles, peering through binoculars from the open hatch of his Panzer IV. Dust devils spun lazily across the dunes. His gunner, Jürgen, chuckled as a new silhouette appeared on the horizon. "Another one of those American boxes," he muttered, squinting at the awkward tank cresting the ridge. The newcomer's flat front, high profile, and slab-sided turret made it unmistakable. "Sherman," Krauser confirmed with a smirk. "It's like they built it in a hurry." "Probably did." The crew laughed. In their minds, this was no threat, just another mass-produced toy in the sandbox, another target practice session courtesy of Detroit. The panzer troops of the Afrika Korps had spent months dueling with British Crusaders and Matildas, but this American newcomer, the M4, looked taller, thinner-skinned, and utterly unsuited for the unforgiving crucible of desert warfare. By noon, the first encounter was over. The Sherman had caught fire after a single 75mm round from Jürgen's gun. As its crew bailed out, another Sherman was being bracketed by a pair of Panzer IIIs, smoke trailing from its turret ring. Krauser radioed in with dry efficiency, 2 new enemy tanks eliminated. Visibility good. They burned just like the rest. It was the beginning of a perception that would harden across the Wehrmacht like concrete. The Sherman was a joke. A rushed, inferior machine from a country that had never fought a modern war. German tankers coined nicknames with cruel satisfaction: Tommy Cooker, for how easily it caught fire; Ronson, after the lighter brand, lights every time. By the time the battles in Tunisia unfolded in 1943, the legend had taken root. In their thickly accented sarcasm, veteran Panzer commanders mocked the Sherman as an American oven with tracks. Its gasoline engine, they claimed, turned every penetration into an inferno. Its tall chassis made it an ideal target. Its armor was described as tinfoil next to the frontal plate of a Tiger. Confidence radiated from the Panzer crews. At unit briefings, they were shown silhouettes of the M4 alongside kill diagrams: aim here, the frontal hull; aim there, just below the turret. A single round was usually enough. General Hans Kramer of the Afrika Korps remarked during a staff meeting in early 1943, "If the Americans think tanks are built like cars, they will be unpleasantly corrected." The laughter echoed across command tents and outpost barracks. Even after the Allies landed in Sicily and began pushing north through Italy, the derision continued. German field reports mocked Allied zoo tactics, swarms of Shermans deployed en masse, more resembling a migration than a maneuver. Near Salerno, a German Tiger platoon commander recorded a simple after-action note: encountered 6 Shermans. Eliminated all. Retreated due to fuel. The implication was clear: they could kill them at will, but logistics, not combat, limited their kills. For every Sherman they destroyed, 3 more seemed to arrive. But this, too, was taken as a sign of inferiority. "Quantity over quality," muttered Panzer Major Kurt Esser in a 1943 journal entry. "They send boys in machines built like cereal boxes. We send men in steel." Yet for all the disdain, a subtle anxiety was growing in the background. Some German crews had begun noticing disturbing trends. In a few cases, Shermans kept fighting after multiple hits. Their engines roared back to life after seeming dead. Crews remanned burning tanks and kept them in the fight. One tank commander near Monte Cassino reported watching a Sherman take 2 50mm penetrations, only to reverse behind cover, fire a smoke round, and reappear with another platoon. Like cockroaches, he noted bitterly. Still, these were considered flukes. The German command's official stance was clear: the Sherman was an inferior machine. A tool of mass production, not military excellence. When the first engagements between Shermans and Tigers occurred in Normandy, the results seemed to confirm it. A single Tiger could knock out multiple Shermans before withdrawing unscathed. One report from Normandy described the tank battles as butchery, with Allied tank crews joking grimly about needing 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, 4 to distract it, 1 to sneak around. Luftwaffe recon flights returned with images showing dozens of Shermans knocked out across the Bocage, burning carcasses littering French fields. German propaganda pounced on these images, publishing them as proof of the Sherman's failure. Posters circulated in occupied territories showing Tiger tanks silhouetted against flaming Shermans, with captions like, "Quality wins." Hitler himself, during one of his famously erratic briefings, referred to the American tank as a moving coffin, barely concealing his disdain. The belief in the Shermans' inferiority became doctrine, shared, repeated, reinforced. But what the Germans failed to grasp, what they wouldn't see until it was too late, was that the Shermans' true power wasn't in any single engagement. It wasn't meant to win duels. It wasn't meant to be beautiful, or feared on paper. It was meant to move. To cross rivers, deserts, forests, and bridges. To be repaired in the field with interchangeable parts. To be shipped by the hundreds on cargo ships. To be crewed by farm boys trained in Oklahoma and Michigan who could be taught to fight with discipline and coordination. It wasn't the machine that mattered, it was the system behind it. As 1944 unfolded, the cracks in the German war machine grew wider. Fuel was scarce. Air superiority had shifted. And across every front, more Shermans kept arriving. In France, in Belgium, in the forests of the Ardennes. What had once seemed like American arrogance was becoming something far more dangerous. Cold, industrial inevitability. But in those early days, in Tunisia and Italy and even the opening months of Normandy, the laughter still echoed. They called it a joke. They thought it was weak. They believed, with every fiber of their professional pride, that the Sherman was a symbol of Allied navy. What they didn't realize was that they weren't fighting a tank. They were fighting a nation that had turned war into an assembly line. And the assembly line was just getting started. By the time the Germans began to realize the Sherman wasn't going away, it was already too late. American factories were producing them at a rate the German war machine couldn't even begin to comprehend. While Germany clung to the idea of elite craftsmanship, meticulously machining each component of its Tiger and Panther tanks by hand, the United States had applied assembly line logic to armored warfare. Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh didn't just build tanks. They mass-produced them the same way they built Chevrolets and Frigidaires. It was never about making the perfect tank. It was about making a good enough tank in overwhelming numbers, with a supply chain behind it that ensured the parts to fix, replace, and upgrade were already on the way before the first turret ever turned in combat. By late 1943, Sherman production had reached nearly 2,000 tanks per month. The Detroit tank arsenal, built in just 6 months by Chrysler, could produce one every 25 minutes at its peak. The Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, Baldwin in Pennsylvania, Pressed Steel in Illinois, even appliance manufacturers were contracted to assemble subcomponents. There wasn't one Sherman factory, there were dozens, all churning out standardized parts that could be bolted together on the battlefield if needed. The Germans, for all their technological marvels, couldn't keep up. A Tiger tank took 300,000 man-hours to complete. A Panther needed 150,000. An M4 Sherman required less than 30,000. That meant for every Tiger rolling off the line, America could field 10 Shermans, and still have men left over to build trucks, jeeps, planes, and artillery. German logistics groaned under the complexity of maintaining so many tank models. The Tiger used different track widths than the Panther. The Panther's final drive was prone to failure. Spare parts had to be shipped by rail through territory increasingly ravaged by Allied bombers. And if a tank broke down in combat, it was often abandoned. The Shermans, by contrast, were designed for field maintenance. Crews could swap out engines, transmissions, and even entire turrets in days, sometimes hours. Units carried toolkits designed for in-field overhauls. A disabled Sherman wasn't a write-off, it was just a temporary setback. The Germans were building weapons of war. The Americans were building a system of war. That system extended far beyond the tank itself. For every Sherman, there was a recovery vehicle ready to tow it, a fuel truck waiting nearby, mechanic trained in troubleshooting the exact engine variant in use, and a pipeline of replacements already loaded onto ships headed for Le Havre or Naples or Cherbourg. German commanders began noticing that Sherman formations they had decimated one day would return at full strength within a week. Intelligence reports from late 1943 referred to this as ghost armor, the seeming ability of American tank units to regenerate. The reality was simpler. The Shermans never stopped coming. Even when one was destroyed, its parts were often salvaged to keep others running. Tank crews shared spare track links, road wheels, even gun sights, all interchangeable across models. That modularity meant frontline units could keep moving while their German counterparts stalled, waiting for a single replacement part stuck behind a bombed-out rail line. In January 1944, a German Panzer grenadier commander wrote bitterly in his diary after the Battle of San Pietro. "We knock out 10 Shermans, and 20 more arrive. We hit them again, and by the next morning they are back." Do they grow these machines in the earth like weeds? No. They grew them in factories, massive, tireless, smoke-belching temples of industrial war. American war planners understood that superiority didn't have to mean technical brilliance. It meant outproducing, outshipping, and outfixing your enemy until he couldn't field tanks fast enough to matter. And behind those tanks were crews. Young, often inexperienced, sometimes terrified, but trained to work as a team. Radio intercoms allowed better communication between driver, gunner, commander, and loader. Radios in every tank meant coordination across platoons and companies in real time. German tanks, by comparison, often had only the commander on the radio, with others relying on flags or line-of-sight orders, slower, riskier, easier to disrupt. The Shermans didn't win every duel. In fact, on a one-on-one basis, the odds were rarely in their favor against a Panther or Tiger. But the war wasn't fought one-on-one. It was fought with coordination, overwhelming firepower, artillery support, air superiority, and the relentless weight of numbers. For every Panther deployed in Normandy, the Allies fielded more than 10 Shermans. That ratio alone told the story of a conflict no longer balanced on tactical brilliance, but on strategic inevitability. General Heinz Guderian, father of German armored warfare, understood the danger when he visited the Eastern Front in 1943 and observed the mass of Soviet T-34s. Quantity, he noted grimly, has a quality all its own. He later amended that observation after watching American logistics at work in Italy. Quantity with reliability, he said, that is unstoppable. The Sherman embodied that concept. It didn't need to be the best. It needed to be there, everywhere, rolling forward, again and again, no matter how many were destroyed. American planners called it war of movement. German veterans called it steel rain. In France, in Italy, in the hedgerows and the forests, the Sherman came back, stronger each time. Because the factories never stopped. The trains never stopped. The ships never stopped. And the system, the American way of war, never stopped. For the Wehrmacht, the laughter had begun to fade. The burning hulks in fields once filled them with pride. Now they just marked the beginning of the next wave. The Sherman wasn't a joke anymore. It was an avalanche. And avalanches don't turn. They don't dodge. They roll forward. Unstoppable. By the summer of 1944, Allied tank crews had stopped expecting miracles from the Sherman. They knew exactly what their machines could and couldn't do. The jokes had faded. The illusions burned away, sometimes literally, in the charred wrecks of earlier battles. What remained was a hard-earned understanding of how to survive. And how to win. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the Shermans suffered badly at first. German 88s lay in wait behind bocage, camouflaged to perfection, waiting for the first tank to nose through a break in the earth wall. One hit, sometimes two, and the lead Sherman would erupt in flame. The crew rarely had time to bail. What followed, almost always, was hesitation. Then another tank crept forward, and the pattern repeated. The Germans knew the ground. They had the better defensive guns. They had the range. The Americans had to learn. Fast. The first lesson came in blood: don't go through the hedgerows, go over them. Field modifications began within days of the first ambushes. Soldiers welded metal prongs, salvaged from beach obstacles or scrounged from scrap yards, to the front of their tanks. They became known as rhino tanks. Instead of pushing through a lane and exposing their sides, they now ripped directly through the hedgerow walls, punching through with surprise. Ambush positions were flanked before they could fire. German gun crews found themselves facing fire they hadn't prepared for. It wasn't elegant. It was crude, improvised, American. And it worked. The second lesson was even more important: don't fight the German tanks on their terms. Don't try to trade shots with a Panther at 1,200 meters. Don't line up with a Tiger and expect the front armor to hold. Instead, call in artillery. Call in air support. Flank. Move. Force them to reposition, to expose their sides. It wasn't about tank-on-tank dueling anymore. It was about coordination. A platoon of Shermans working together could destroy a Tiger, but it meant using maneuver and deception. One tank might be lost baiting the shot, while others used the moment to attack the sides or rear. The Americans turned combat into a team sport, not a solo duel. Tankers began training with infantry. They developed hand signals, radio codes, integrated drills. One squad would move in front to flush out anti-tank guns while Shermans provided suppressive fire. GIs learned to trust their tanks, and tankers learned to trust their infantry. That bond saved lives. In one case near St. Lo, a Sherman bogged down in soft ground as a Panther crested a hill just 800 meters away. The gunner called out, "We're dead." The driver braced for impact. But a nearby infantryman with a bazooka, acting without orders, scrambled onto a farmhouse roof and fired from behind. The rocket struck the Panther's engine deck. Flames engulfed the turret. The Sherman crew lived. They never forgot that shot, or that soldier. In countless after-action reports, the pattern repeated: Shermans weren't surviving alone. They were surviving as part of a combined arms doctrine that evolved with every engagement. Allied commanders reinforced this with aggressive adaptation. Units rotated through the front lines quickly, allowing new crews to gain experience without being wiped out. Tank battalions kept detailed logs of lessons learned. After every mission, gunners reviewed gun camera footage. Crews were debriefed. Mistakes were dissected. Successes were documented and copied. American war colleges couldn't have designed a better training pipeline. The battlefield became the classroom, and it taught hard, fast, and without mercy. By August, American tankers were no longer novices. They had fought from hedgerows to towns, from forests to bridges. They had watched friends die. They had walked back from burning tanks. And they had learned. They knew how to use smoke shells to conceal movement. How to reverse into hold-down positions. How to lead a German turret's slow traverse. How to use their own machine guns to identify muzzle flashes in tree lines. Most importantly, they knew that survival wasn't luck, it was process. There was one more crucial evolution: artillery coordination. The 105mm howitzer-equipped Shermans, called assault guns, began playing a bigger role. When resistance was identified, an anti-tank nest, a fortified village, those Shermans would lob shells over the horizon before standard tanks moved in. Infantry would mark targets with colored smoke, and within minutes, entire buildings could be reduced to rubble. Fire support became as routine as refueling. Shermans even began carrying field radios tuned to fighter bomber frequencies. When needed, they could call in P-47 Thunderbolts for a surgical strike. No German tank had that kind of reach. The learning curve was steep, but it bent quickly. And it was measured in outcomes. By the time the Allies reached the outskirts of Paris, German tank kill ratios were shrinking. The 5 Shermans per Panther myth was breaking down. In several engagements, Allied forces overwhelmed elite German units, not by shooting straighter or having stronger armor, but by being in the right place, with more tanks, more support, and better timing. The experience showed in their reactions. Early in the war, a Sherman crew spotting a Tiger might panic, reverse, or freeze. By September 1944, the same crew would call in a grid coordinate, fire a smoke round, and move to reposition. Meanwhile, artillery and air power would be in motion within minutes. That calm, that reflex, that was experience. That was what won wars. In an internal Wehrmacht assessment following the Battle of Falaise Gap, captured Allied tank unit was described as methodical, disciplined, and unnervingly coordinated. German commanders, once so sure of their superiority, began warning of American swarm tactics, not just in numbers, but in timing. Their tanks didn't just arrive. They arrived together, with infantry, mortars, air cover, and supply. It was a machine. Not just the Sherman, but the whole force behind it. And that machine had learned to fight. Through fire. Through loss. Through the hard lessons that only war can teach. The Germans had laughed at the tank. But they weren't laughing anymore at the men inside it. As the Allies pushed further into France and the Shermans' numbers swelled, it became clear that the tank's true strength wasn't found in its armor or gun, it was in how it fit into something larger. The German High Command had spent years perfecting the art of armored warfare, focusing on individual units, elite crews, and the sheer shock of overwhelming force. But the Americans were doing something the Wehrmacht hadn't planned for. They weren't just fielding tanks, they were building a battlefield network. Coordination became the Sherman's most potent weapon. On its own, it might lose a duel. But paired with artillery batteries, recon patrols, close air support, and real-time radio communication, the Sherman wasn't fighting alone. It was fighting as part of a living, breathing organism. One that could adapt, respond, and overwhelm. German commanders began to note this in their reports. After-action documents from units in the Falaise pocket and around Mortain describe a peculiar phenomenon. When one Sherman was spotted, more appeared within minutes. Not just tanks, but infantry, tank destroyers, and sometimes even fighter bombers overhead. To the Germans, it felt like the sky and ground moved in unison. That was no accident. By mid-1944, American doctrine had evolved into what some called rolling integration. Forward observers traveled with armor units. Their sole job was to spot enemy positions and instantly relay them to artillery command. Fire missions could be coordinated and fired in under 4 minutes. Smoke, white phosphorus, all of it dialed in on targets the Shermans marked or requested. Crews didn't wait. They expected support. And the support came. Pilots flying P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs were trained to identify flares and panel markings from armored columns. If a tank unit was pinned down by a Panther behind a tree line, they didn't have to expose themselves to fire. They could pop red smoke, radio a grid, and within minutes, the tree line would be shredded by 500-pound bombs or a rocket strike. Tankers called it pulling the lever. One command, one signal, and the sky answered. German tanks had firepower. But American tanks had teamwork. The 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, embodied this concept during the breakout from Normandy. In one battle near Saint-Sever, a mixed force of Shermans, self-propelled artillery, and armored infantry punched through a German defensive line in a coordinated assault that lasted less than 20 minutes. It wasn't brute force, it was choreography. As Shermans laid down suppressive fire, mortars softened the flanks. Infantry dismounted and cleared AT nests. Then, as German reinforcements moved in, a flight of P-47s struck their convoy. The enemy never had time to respond. The Shermans didn't act as lone predators. They were the armored fists of a much larger creature. In Belgium, a Tiger crew reported engaging 3 Shermans near Bastogne. They destroyed 2 and forced the 3rd into retreat, until 6 more appeared from a nearby tree line. A concealed 57mm AT gun fired from the flank. Then artillery struck behind them. What began as a straightforward kill turned into chaos. The Tiger was immobilized, then hit again by a bazooka. The commander survived, but later wrote, "We weren't outgunned. We were outnumbered, outflanked, outcoordinated. It was like fighting the wind." The difference was communication. Every Sherman had a radio. Every tank commander could talk to his platoon, his company, and often, directly to support elements. Orders didn't wait for couriers or whistles. They came through the headset, fast and clear. And the American radios worked. German tanks often had a single set per platoon, reserved for the unit commander. The rest relied on hand signals, flags, or guessing. In the noise and smoke of battle, that gap was fatal. American tankers exploited it. Hit from one side, they'd flank from another. Pin one unit, then rotate to strike a second. It wasn't flawless. Miscommunication happened. Crews still died. But over time, the system became second nature. It allowed American armored divisions to maneuver faster, react quicker, and press advantages more aggressively. The 3rd Armored Division proved this during Operation Cobra. As the front lines broke, columns of Shermans moved with such speed and cohesion that German defenders often couldn't tell where the main thrust was. Reports spoke of phantom units appearing behind lines, of bridges captured before they could be destroyed. The Shermans weren't just advancing, they were coordinating with engineers, signal units, and reconnaissance squads to keep moving. Even terrain became a weapon. Where the Germans saw rivers and forests as obstacles, the Americans saw opportunities for coordinated crossings and ambushes. The 4th Armored Division once used a smoke screen provided by artillery to mask a flanking move across the Via River. German defenders expected a frontal assault. Instead, Shermans burst from their flank at sunrise, supported by infantry and machine gun fire from half-tracks. The entire German line collapsed within hours. Shermans began moving with mounted infantry riding on their decks, called tank descents. It was risky, but fast. Troops could dismount instantly and clear buildings or woods while the tank provided cover. The relationship between tank and infantry evolved into something intimate, even personal. Crews shared rations. GIs cleaned the tanks. In return, the Shermans shielded them from machine guns and mortars. The battlefield became a dance. Each element playing a role. A German general after the war was asked how the Americans managed to coordinate such large formations so smoothly. His answer was simple. They talked to each other. We shouted. They listened. We waited. They moved like water. The Sherman may not have been the best tank on paper. But in practice, backed by an orchestra of coordination, it became something more, a conductor. It signaled. It guided. It anchored the battle. And when everything moved in concert, air, artillery, infantry, logistics, it didn't matter if the Tiger was stronger. The Sherman wasn't alone. And that changed everything. By late 1944, the Germans were no longer just facing the Sherman. They were being surrounded by it. Encircled. Crushed. What had started as mockery had turned into dread, and now that dread was becoming resignation. The Sherman was everywhere. It was the first thing they saw when they opened their optics in the morning haze, and the last thing they heard when the ground trembled beneath their dugouts. The Panzers, once the unstoppable force of Blitzkrieg, were now being hunted, trapped, and overwhelmed in battles they could no longer dictate. It wasn't a fair fight anymore. The Wehrmacht had known how to win in open country, with fast-moving armor and elite crews seizing initiative. But now the Allies had flipped the map. The American war machine was dictating tempo, pace, and pressure. In the fields of France, in the forests of the Ardennes, along the Siegfried Line, Shermans rolled in waves. Not recklessly. Not suicidally. But relentlessly. For every Tiger or Panther waiting in ambush, there were 5 Shermans advancing in coordinated columns, backed by air power, artillery, engineers, and infantry. And when one Sherman died, another took its place. And another. And another. In the Lorraine campaign, German armored divisions tried to maneuver against Patton's Third Army. But maneuver warfare only works when you have fuel, spare parts, and uncontested air. The Germans had none of those. Shermans, on the other hand, had full tanks, clean oil, and maps marked with fuel dumps and maintenance depots set up just days earlier. Even when a Panther scored a kill, it rarely escaped. The second wave of Shermans would mark its muzzle flash, flank it, and reduce it to a smoking hulk within minutes. The vaunted German edge in firepower no longer mattered when they couldn't escape the counterattack. In one engagement near Aricourt, a handful of Shermans from the U.S. 4th Armored Division held off and then destroyed over a dozen Panthers in a swirling fog that nullified long-range gunnery. The German tanks, blind and unsupported, tried to pivot and fire. But the Shermans worked in pairs, one drew fire, the other closed in. When the fog lifted, the Panthers were burning. The American losses were light. That battle became a blueprint. Mobility, communication, and pressure were the new currency of victory, not just armor thickness. Allied tank commanders learned to recognize German overconfidence. If a Tiger appeared and held its ground, the response was not to challenge it directly, but to isolate it. Mines, roadblocks, smoke, infantry with bazookas, whatever it took to pin it down. Then the Shermans circled. They weren't hunting for glory. They were executing doctrine. Even the German tank aces, men like Michael Wittmann and Otto Carius, found themselves being cut off, outflanked, and suffocated by this new kind of warfare. One Tiger in a village no longer dominated the battlefield. It simply attracted fire from every angle. In the Battle of Aachen, a Tiger battalion tried to halt an American advance by anchoring a defensive line in the ruins of the city. For a time, they held. Shermans were lost to well-placed 88mm shots. But then the pattern emerged. The Americans didn't retreat. They called in bulldozers to knock down walls. They redirected infantry through the rubble. They used artillery to drop smoke and heat on suspected gun positions. By the third day, the Tigers were running low on ammo and fuel, boxed in by artillery and air strikes. One was destroyed not by another tank, but by a 500-pound bomb from AP-47. By the fourth day, the line collapsed. What the Germans realized too late was that the Shermans didn't have to win individual duels. They only had to survive long enough for the system around them to win the battle. And survive they did. At the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, the last major German offensive in the West smashed into the Ardennes forest. The Germans hoped for speed, surprise, and shock, reminiscent of their 1940 glory days. They brought King Tigers, Panthers, Jag Panzer IVs. But the terrain favored defense, and the weather, at first their ally, soon cleared. The Shermans returned in force. Air power resumed. The roads clogged. And the American response hardened. In towns like Bastogne, clusters of Shermans dug in, forming mobile fortresses. Their role wasn't to chase. It was to hold. And they did. When the skies opened and thunderbolts roared overhead, the German columns found themselves paralyzed. Hundreds of vehicles were destroyed in ambushes from the air and ground. The Shermans surged. Within 3 weeks, the offensive had not just failed, it had shattered the last reserves of Germany's armored might. Panther crews were abandoning tanks for lack of fuel. King Tigers, too heavy for most bridges, bogged down and were destroyed by artillery or even simply abandoned. The Wehrmacht had lost the initiative. The Shermans had taken it. As the Allies crossed into Germany itself in 1945, the landscape of war had changed entirely. German defenses crumbled not from tactical defeat, but from exhaustion. The Shermans came in columns, spearheading armored thrusts across the Rhine, fanning out along every highway and back road. They seized airfields, captured bridges, encircled entire divisions. Even when met by resistance, they didn't halt. They maneuvered, called in support, kept pressing. Panzer units tried to regroup, but the coordination that had once defined the German armored corps was gone. Fuel was gone. Morale was gone. Air superiority was gone. And the Shermans were still coming. The tank that had once been a punchline was now writing the final chapter of the Third Reich. Not because it was unbeatable, but because it was unstoppable. A force not of technical brilliance, but of operational dominance. The Americans hadn't built a better tank. They had built a better war. By the time the smoke cleared in May 1945, the tank that Germany had once laughed at stood triumphant across an entire continent. From the beaches of Normandy to the cobblestone ruins of Berlin's outskirts, from the deserts of North Africa to the deep forests of the Ardennes, the Sherman had carried its crews through mud, blood, fire, and frost. It had been torched, patched, rebuilt, upgunned, repainted, and repurposed. But it had never stopped. And in its persistence, it had done something extraordinary. It had helped bury the myth of the invincible Panzer for good. Crews who had once climbed into their Shermans with hesitation now spoke of the tank with a strange reverence. They still knew its flaws. The armor was never thick enough. The gun, even in later versions, sometimes struggled against the newest German designs. And yet, the Sherman had something few machines in that war ever earned: trust. It started when a crew survived its first hit. Not everyone did. But those who did came out changed. They remembered the turret ring that jammed but still turned with a kick. The periscope that took a round and saved a commander's life. The radial engine that refused to quit, even while trailing oil and shrapnel. The loader whose arm was burned pulling open a stuck hatch. The driver who found a slope to back into when reverse was the only option. These weren't statistics, they were men. And the Sherman kept them alive more times than its critics ever expected. Its mobility had been questioned. But it crossed terrain heavier tanks couldn't touch. Its firepower had been mocked. But by war's end, the 76mm high-velocity variant was knocking out Panthers and Tigers with properly placed shots. Some crews even called it Firefly, Shermans, British modified versions mounting a 17-pounder gun that turned the tables entirely. But even without those upgrades, the tank's greatest weapon was always the same: the team inside it, and the system around it. In one post-war survey, more than 70% of US tankers expressed high confidence in their Shermans, especially in mobility and reliability. German crews respected the machine not because it was superior in a technical duel, but because it never fought alone. When a Panther saw one Sherman, it had to assume 5 more were coming. When a Tiger knocked one out, artillery usually followed. When a German column advanced, it didn't fear a single gun, it feared the grid-coordinated response of Shermans, tank destroyers, P-47s, and mortars. And the name, Sherman, stuck. M4 was the official designation. But in every war journal, radio call, and after-action report, it was simply Sherman. A name that became shorthand for pressure, persistence, and presence. The tank's legacy didn't end in Europe. It kept fighting, across the Pacific, where its range and durability proved vital in island campaigns. In Okinawa, Shermans landed with flamethrower variants, clearing cave systems. In the Philippines, they provided mobile fire support where jungle terrain broke down supply chains. Even after the war, the Sherman story continued. It became the backbone of dozens of post-war armies. From Korea to the Middle East, from South America to the Indian subcontinent, nations adopted it, modified it, upgraded it. Some added diesel engines. Others added new guns, suspension, optics. Some were turned into armored recovery vehicles or mobile artillery platforms. The tank refused to become obsolete. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israeli Shermans, some now fitted with French 75mm high-velocity guns, fought and destroyed more modern Soviet-supplied tanks from neighboring countries. Tactical brilliance, combined with upgraded firepower and aggressive maneuvering, allowed crews in 2-decade-old Shermans to outfight T-34s and even some T-55s. It was like watching a retired athlete return for one last game, and win. The design philosophy behind the Sherman, standardization, maintainability, integration, went on to define post-war American doctrine. Later tanks like the M48 Patton and M60 retained many of its principles: mobility first, reliability over luxury, adaptability as a core feature. Even the M1 Abrams, decades later, owes part of its DNA to the logistics first, battlefield network mindset the Sherman pioneered. Veterans who had fought in them often remembered their Shermans with surprising warmth. Not because they were safe. They weren't. But because they were there. In the mud. In the snow. In the hedgerows and the mountains and the cities. The Sherman didn't win admiration through awe. It earned it through sweat and consistency. Mechanics loved it because they could strip an engine in the field. Supply officers loved it because parts were interchangeable. Infantry loved it because it showed up when needed. And commanders loved it because they could plan around it, not hoping it would work, but knowing it would. In German interrogations after the war, one phrase appeared again and again: we couldn't keep up. They weren't just talking about the numbers. They meant the tempo. The unrelenting rhythm of a war machine that operated without pause. In captured Wehrmacht diaries, one line written near the end of the war stood out. "The Shermans do not sleep. They return. Always." It became a kind of myth, whispered in foxholes and truck cabins. The sense that no matter how many were knocked out, more would come. Not because of magic, or luck, but because of process. That was the Shermans' greatest achievement. It proved that war wasn't only won by the best design on paper, but by the best plan in reality. It was the tank that didn't have to be perfect, because it was present. The tank that crews trusted, because they knew it would keep moving, firing, and fighting until the war was over. And when the war ended, many of them left their names carved inside its armor. A way of saying thanks. A final mark, etched into the steel of a machine that had carried them through hell and home again. The Germans had laughed at the Sherman. But when the dust settled, it was the Sherman that stood among the ruins. Not as a monument to genius, but as proof that in the end, durability, teamwork, and unyielding will could overcome anything. Even the most feared tanks in the world.